Hello. It is such a pleasure to be here talking to you today about a subject that I think is so important and so critical to the future of our open source communities. And I call that subject open source is not just about code. And it's about creating effective strategies for communication and collaboration together. Before we get started, let me just mention a few words about who is speaking to you today. So my name is Ben, and I am a lead developer relations engineer at New Relic. We are an observability and monitoring platform for your applications and services from big to enormous. And I live outside Tel Aviv in Israel. And prior to becoming a software developer, I'm a career switcher myself. Prior to becoming a software developer, I spent nearly a decade working in informal adult education across the United States. So the idea of creating welcoming communities of people who are voluntarily giving their time to pursue a common purpose together is something that I deeply feel and resonate with and connect to as part of my previous career and something I bring into the work that I'm doing now at New Relic. Something that I think is fundamentally important when we begin this conversation is talking about the hierarchy of involvement. You know, we often struggle with thinking about ways we can capture people's attention and get people inspired to become involved. And I think this quote, this anonymous quote, is profound in what it teaches us. So the anonymous quote goes along something like this: "Tell me and I'll forget. Show me and I may remember. Involve me and I'll understand." Meaning, if you only tell me something, as soon as we walk away from that conversation, my mind has wandered off to a dozen other things I need to think about work, about family, about my obligations, and that conversation has been buried deep in my memory. If you show me, if you have a frontal presentation and you demonstrate for me the ways to get involved, well, that may stick in my memory a bit more. That may stay with me a bit longer, but it's not going to necessarily capture my attention. But if you involve me, if you ask me to participate, if you find and carve out pathways for me to get involved, if you put a seat at the table for me, then not only will I not forget, not only will I remember, but I'm going to become a part of this community because I feel, and this is so fundamentally important, I feel like I matter. And regardless if the community is a community of hobbyists, it's a technical community, if it's a professional community, if it's a personal community, the idea that you matter, the idea that the community cares about you is what is critically important to engaging both people who are longtime contributors and keeping them engaged and making space and room for newcomers into the projects and into the communities that we so deeply and passionately care about. We know that writing good code, any one of us who has tried to write code and try to do it according to design patterns and best practices and clean code, we know that writing good code can be very challenging. But we also sometimes forget that is true as well for collaboration. That is not only the interaction of myself and my code editor that can be challenging, but the interaction of myself and another person, between me and you, between me and another human being, that can also be deeply, deeply challenging. And we need to put work and effort into that as much as we do into our code. And the open source community today is just an example of the necessity of doing so. We have tens of millions of open issues within the open source community across all the popular repository projects that exist across all the popular places people host their code on GitHub and GitLab and other places. And these communities span the globe of cultures and languages and peoples and personality types. So if we want to be effective in welcoming ourselves and being welcomed as new contributors, if we want to get involved in the dynamicism of open source, then we need to address this big issue, which is how we do it effectively as human beings, one with each other. So what we're going to do today together in this conversation is first we're going to diagnose some problems that exist currently in the open source community. We're going to offer strategies for more effective collaboration, and we're going to share a practical example in the real world of open source of how this can be done well. Let's get started by talking about those problems, because if we don't understand the problems, we can't offer solutions. The first problem we're going to discuss is what we call communication. This problem is so utterly prevalent among open source projects, which is the way in which we speak to each other. Now, there's something that happens when I'm speaking to another person not face to face. When I'm speaking to another person through and mediated by a screen, the anonymity of that conversation allows for many people, and for all of us at times, our filter of what feels appropriate, our ability to see the other human in front of us gets diminished, and our communication style gets aggravated as a result of that. And this one example you see in front of your screen now is only one of many of these problematic forms of communication. Now, if we wanted to move an issue forward, if I really felt that this website, whatever this example is about, if I really felt this website needed some help on it and needed some improvement, this way of communicating to the maintainer of that website would probably not move my agenda forward. And yet, this style of communication is so common because for some reason, when we're sitting in front of our monitors, we're able to reduce the filters in which we speak to each other and not see each other as people. And as a result, we're less effective. You know, nowadays, as Professor Sherry Turkle at MIT, who is a fantastic thinker on the societal challenges of technology, she writes that we expect more from technology and less from each other. We want our computers to be as performant as possible. We want the batteries in our laptops to last all day. We want to be able to run multiple applications and compile all of our code and stream at the same time, but we don't have that same high standard of expectation from one another as human beings. And perhaps if we lifted up our expectations of each other, if we raise the standards by the ways we speak as much as we raise the standards for how we expect our tech to act, we could create a much more healthy, much more holistic and welcoming open source community. The second problem that we're going to talk about is the problem of time. And what do I mean by time? So let's look at it through the lens of Hacktoberfest. And we're going to have my friend here, Michael, share with us his thoughts on Hacktoberfest. Now, we know that Hacktoberfest is this wildly popular open source event that happens every year, sponsored by many wonderful organizations and companies, which invites tens of thousands of new open source contributors for the first time getting involved in making commits and getting involved in pushing up code and docs and other forms of contribution to open source projects across the spectrum. And as a result of that, there is some incentivization of swag, meaning if you could accomplish the specs for the Hacktoberfest of that year, typically a certain number of successfully committed pull requests, then you are entitled to a swag package. It gets delivered to your home, usually a t-shirt and some awesome stickers. So Michael talks about his first time as a maintainer for an open source project that was open for Hacktoberfest contributions. Remember, in the open source community, there's two different types of contributors, because we're all contributors ultimately. We're all pushing projects forward. But ultimately, there's this dichotomy between the maintainer, the people who are responsible for the integrity of the project, who run the project, so to speak, and what we call roughly the contributors, the people who are pushing up code, who are suggesting challenges or changes or bugs, who are working with the code and the projects, and it's a dynamic conversation between the maintainer and the contributor. So Michael says this is his first year running as a maintainer of an open source project, and he says he really found an issue, which is the committing code to accomplish the swag. It's almost like teaching to the test in an educational context, right? So he says specifically he came across an issue where someone contributed a pull request to his open source project, and the code looked fantastic. And the commit messages, meaning they documented their changes so well, were just wonderful. And as he was reading it and he was investing his time, right? Because time is important both to the contributor who's bringing up the code and the maintainers who need to who need to review it and edit it and suggest changes and integrate it into the project, both take up time of what are most likely volunteers on both ends of that conversation. So he says, as he was reviewing it, it felt eerily familiar. And the reason why is because that code was his code. That contributor had taken his code, copied and pasted it, and push it up as their own in order to try and meet the standard for that Hacktoberfest swag package. Well, time is a really big problem. Time is one of those things that we don't get back. The more we use it, the more we expend it, the less we have of it. It is a finite resource in our lives. So Henry David Thoreau once wrote that it's not enough to be busy. The question is, what are we busy about? And if we are, as a contributor, creating false pull requests in order to accomplish a swag package, in order to be mailed a t-shirt, and taking the time from volunteer maintainers who then have to review that code, it could take who knows how much time in order to realize that that code was not worthwhile, was not contributing productively. Well, that time never comes back to those people. And so what is the underlying problem here? Why is it that we have a culture where people feel both as maintainers their time is not valued, and as contributors either they're doing it in a way which, is a bit malicious, maybe not so fair, or they're doing it in a way that they're not intending to take up the time of the maintainer, but they don't know how to contribute productively. So they end up writing code or making commits that don't actually work and move the project forward, thereby using up their valuable time and also using up the time of maintainers, which is also valuable time. So we really need to talk about the ways in which we more productively create conduits for contributors, maintainers to more effectively use their time and not feel like it is wasted. The last area that we're going to spend some bit of our time talking about is what we call the paradox of choice. The open source projects today that are very popular can have at times hundreds, maybe over 1,000 open issues for some of them, meaning an issue on an open source project is where someone has said, this is something we would like to work on. And I'm raising this with some specifications for what the problem is and maybe how it can be addressed. And I'm inviting the open source community to get involved in working on this issue. Now, if I come to an open source project and I'm really engaged with it and I'm a user of it and I want to start contributing to it, and I come in there and I'm like, okay, what is something I can work on? So I click on that little issues link on the navigation bar, and I come onto the issues page, and I see there's hundreds and hundreds of open issues. I'm going to end up spending so much time just staring at that page. It's kind of like when you walk into a grocery store and you just want to purchase some peanut butter for your household. And you come into the aisle of peanut butter and there's not one, there's not two, there's not three peanut butter choices, but there are hundreds of peanut butter choices. You can end up spending, who knows how long, standing in that peanut butter aisle, trying to figure out what are the minute differences between each brand of peanut butter and which one is the right one for your family. And so what could have been a 5-minute trip to the grocery store ends up being an hour and a half because you're just stuck staring at all the choices. So there's this paradox where choice is awesome and having choices is great, but at some point, when you have so many choices, that actually ends up being limiting in your ability to act. It reduces your agency as a person who can move things forward and actually limits your freedom, as the Decision Lab in a lot of their research has indicated. So how do we create thought out choices? How do we identify issues that are good for the newcomer, maybe many of us in this conversation today, and good for the veteran person involved in the project? How do we create issues that make sense for people depending on their skill set and help people navigate? So we may have hundreds of issues, but if I, as a newcomer to the project or as an old comer to the project, can quickly understand the differences between issues and know where my time will be most valued, I can navigate expeditiously through them and come to the issues where I can be most beneficial and feel like I matter the most. So between the issues of time management and the paradox of choice and the ways in which we communicate, now it's upon us to talk about ways in which we can build better, in ways in which we can create more effective, more welcoming, more embracing open source communities that make everyone part of it. The maintainer, the new contributor, the old contributor, the veterans, the newcomers, make them all feel welcome and part of it. And I think the answer lies in perhaps a surprising place. And that answer is within the amazing animal of the sea star or the starfish. This animal, I believe, provides and unlocks for us answers on how to create more effective open source communities. A lot of the ideas that we're going to listen to and discuss together now in the next few minutes come from this remarkable book called The Starfish and the Spider, The Unstoppable Power of Leaderless Organizations, written by Ori Brafman and Rod Beckstrom. And they start by a provocative idea. Let's see what happens when a coercive system takes on an open system. And they contrast the biologies of the starfish and the spider to really unlock amazing ideas for us working in organizations, or in our context, working in open source communities. You know, the starfish is quite a remarkable animal. I'm sure many of you know this. Maybe you saw this when you were a child. I grew up in California, right on the beach, and so I saw many starfish throughout my childhood. And you know that they have this remarkable, amazing ability to be able to regrow their limbs. You know, an entirely new starfish, entirely new sea star can be generated from just a portion of a severed limb. They can go from the most minimalistic, minimally viable project, MVP, so to speak, of a starfish, and go and scale from that to a full IPO. You know, from a starfish MVP to an IPO starfish, just from a single limb, and they can go back down to an MVP when they have no choice and they're just a severed limb. That is absolutely phenomenal and unbelievably remarkable in the biological world. In addition to that, the instrument, the mechanism by which they traverse nutrients through their body is not blood like us, it's actually water. They use salt water to convey nutrients through their body in place of blood. Now, something about salt water, seawater, if you will, in the environment of the starfish is it is incredibly abundant. They live in the ocean. They are surrounded by seawater. So they take what is most around them and they maximally use it. They understand the environment and the context in which they live, you know, through the evolutionary process, and they take advantage of that to their maximal benefit. I think that we, as open source contributors, as people who want to get involved in open source, as the maintainers of open source, we can be more like starfish. How's that so? I think that can be manifested in 5 distinct ways. Decentralization, keep it stupid simple, KISS, adaptability, scalability, and being participatory. Let's look at each one of those. When you decentralize something, now that picture you see on this slide is from Burning Man, maybe the ultimate example of a decentralized community of people coming together to create a community really on built on the foundation of leaderlessness. So when you give people freedom, you will get chaos. You're going to get burning men, right? You're going to get incredible acts of art and creativity along with that chaos. But how do you mitigate the chaos? How do you navigate between chaos and the creativity within an open source community? I think you have to address that conversation because of something we started with in the beginning of our talk together, which is that open source communities today span the globe. And the more centralized the community, the more top down it is in structure and in stricture, the more it exposes the biases of the individuals who are leading that community. So if I am somebody from North America, or maybe I'm somebody from Southeast Asia, or I'm somebody from Kenya, and I am running an open source community in a top-down hierarchical manner, the biases of my culture, the biases of my language, the biases of my background will manifest in the ways that I do that. And the more structured I make it, the more top down it is, the less almost not intentionally, unintentionally, the more unintentionally not inclusive it is of people who are not from my culture, from my background, from my language, from the part of the world that I am in. And so sometimes we need to understand how those varied backgrounds behave and how all of that diversity, as Aaron Meyer, the author of the Culture Map, tells us, can become our team or our open source project's greatest assets. And we do that by creating bottom-up opportunities, meaning we create opportunities within our open source projects where people can get involved in ways that don't dictate the exact and highly specific ways they can get involved. It creates openings of opportunities and not necessarily you must do this in this way and this project will exactly work in this way and it will be done in X, Y, and Z manner. But rather, this is what our goals of our project are, and this is the vision of our project. And now as a community, let's find ways to create it together. And we'll see an example of that near the end. We talk about and show an exact example that I think does that very well. The ways in which you do that, the ways in which you create bottom-up opportunities that balance between chaos and between creativity, because if you only have it leaderlessness, if you only have it with no structure at all, well, then you have a hard time moving forward, a deeply challenging way of moving forward. But if you have it to be utterly top down, then there's no room for people who are not like you. And it makes it very challenging for people from other cultures and other languages and other countries and other contexts to find their space. So the ways in which you can do that, two fundamentally important ways to balance that, is to have a contributing guide and a code of conduct in the root of your project, whether it's on GitHub or GitLab or elsewhere. So for example, New Relic maintains a GitHub organization for open source with hundreds of open source projects in there, and each one of them is bound by an open source community code of conduct, in which, as part of the process of onboarding as a new member of the community, whether it's your first time contributing, your first time raising a comment, your first time raising an issue, you are invited to read that open source community code of conduct and understand what is welcome ways of expressing yourself in this community and what are ways that are not welcome. What are the ways in which we value communication, the ways in which we don't value. We don't value discriminatory language. We don't value discrimination based on any types of identity markers. And these are the ways in which we expect members of our community to speak to each other and about each other. And those explicit codes of conduct, making what we might think are implicit, what we might think are obvious, and making them explicit, help us create places where people from diverse backgrounds can contribute productively because they know the groundwork, they know the framework. And similarly, having a contributing guide which tells the newcomer to the community, these are the ways in which we contribute code. This is what a commit message looks like. Now, we're not going to tell you the exact language to write it or how you express yourself, but we expect, for example, that a commit message might discuss what changed here, what is different, that your opening comments and your opening pull requests might discuss why this was necessary and how it impacted things. We might have in the contributing guide conversations around expectations for testing and new tests that you might contribute, or if you're adding a dependency into the project, how you might do so. The more we can be explicit in our general expectations of involvement, the more welcoming we can be and not need to lean into a top-down structure, and the more we can be a bottom-up, creating a welcoming context for people from across the globe. The second area that is deeply important is what we call keeping it simple. Keeping it simple means, reducing the amount of ambiguous language in our guides and in our documentation for our project. Everything we write for our project needs to address three fundamental questions. What do we want people to know? What do we want people to do? And why should they care? We need to tell people what is this project? What is the aim of this project? What's the goals of this project? We need to tell people who are new to our projects, what do we ask them to do? What does it mean to get involved? What are the areas of involvement? And we also need to address why this project matters. The vision of the project. What is its aims? What does it hope to do to make the software development world better, to make productivity better, whatever its focus area is? Why should they care to get involved? If you can answer those three questions, you'll have gone a long way in helping people get involved by keeping it simple, keeping it succinct to these three specific areas. What do they need to know? What do they need to do? And why should they care? And the best place to do that on the get-go, right from the start, is within the README. In fact, according to data published every year by GitHub on their annual surveys of developers, having a quality README leads to a 55% jump in productivity for open source contributors. A quality README answers those questions in ways that are quick, easy to grasp, and digestible. It reduces flowery language, it reduces, ambiguous language, and just gets right down to the nitty-gritty details in very, very concise terms. And we're going to talk a bit more about READMEs in just a few moments. But knowing that opening salvo, the README, the first thing someone sees when they navigate to your project on GitHub or GitLab or other places, is fundamentally important in setting the expectations and as the doormat, the welcoming doormat into your project. And a good README can lead to a tremendous jump in productivity for both new contributors and indeed also for veteran contributors to the project. Another area is, and I think this is very important, is adaptability. The late great Professor Stephen Hawking once said that intelligence is the ability to adapt to change. Now, open source projects, software in general, goes through cycles. Something becomes the latest and greatest when it starts out, and it is the talk of the town. Everyone's using it. Everyone's writing blog posts and tutorials about it. Then at some point, it becomes a legacy project. And there's many examples of that in the world today. For example, within the JavaScript landscape, one project which doesn't get a lot of love nowadays, but is used still across the board, is something like jQuery. jQuery used to be a way to navigate the browser window in a dynamic sort of fashion, what we expect from modern websites, and it's been quote unquote replaced by a lot of modern JavaScript frameworks that do the work of jQuery, but in more performant perhaps and more easier to digest ways. There's a whole conversation about why these things have supplanted jQuery, but at the end of the day, they haven't really supplanted jQuery. And what do I mean by that is that every survey of what tools developers use, jQuery still comes up way up there. It is heavily used as a library in modern websites. And so the need to maintain, the need to get involved, the need to contribute to jQuery is just as important now as it was when it was the hottest and greatest and latest and newest thing when it first came out. But adapting from the latest and greatest to a legacy open source project requires the need to understand that your place in the ecosystem has shifted and your project as a result has shifted. And so your language needs to shift. What needs to happen? Maybe it's more about maintaining the code and less about new features. That needs to happen so you don't become the blockbuster of the open source community and you maintain relevancy, especially when you're being used still by developers across the world, even if you're not the latest and greatest front-end framework in the JavaScript ecosystem. Similarly, and this is on the same spectrum of adaptability, is the need to be scalable, the need to scale. Open source projects, just like they can go from the hottest and greatest and latest to a legacy project, sometimes faster than you can even realize. They can go from a small, tiny project, a niche project, so to speak, to something that is huge and used by countless developers. And suddenly your project, which you've been working on individually, can now be used by and now having issues raised by hundreds, if not thousands of people. And you need to understand how to scale that project effectively and scale that project in a way that doesn't overburden you, doesn't overburden new contributors, and create space to grow flexibly. That is fundamentally important when we talk about open source projects. Lastly, the project needs to be participatory. And I think one of the greatest examples of participatory projects online in the world today is Wikipedia. The Nieman Lab did great research on discussing what made Wikipedia so successful. And I really love this one area, which is they discovered the one thing that helped really Wikipedia grow so fantastically well and grow so fast was it lowered the barrier to participation. You know, when you're talking about something like a encyclopedia, which has incredibly high standards for accuracy and for relevancy and for maintaining the most accurate form of information on any specific subject, that can compete with participation. That the more accurate and the more exacting you need to be could also lead to an inverse, the harder it is to get involved. But with Wikipedia, they managed to find a way, and of course it was stops and starts initially, but they managed to find a way to be equally exacting, equally detailed, while also welcoming to new contributors. And I think that is incumbent upon open source projects as well. And one way to do that is really important is through the use of labels. Now, labels are a way in which we spoke about initially the paradox of choice. When you come across a GitHub project you're really interested in, open source project, and you want to get involved, you click on the issues and you find hundreds of them. And you just end up staring at your monitor the whole day because you don't know how to get involved. Labels allow us to quickly allow a new user to quickly navigate those hundreds of issues and find the one that is maybe most appropriate for them. A label lets us answer the question for others of what is this? What's the category of this issue? Is it a bug? Is this issue something that's good for a first timer? Is this issue something where I'm trying to work on it, but I need some help, like a help wanted? Is this issue really a question and we want to provoke and start a conversation? And it allows the new user or the newcomer to the project to be able to say, well, what do I want to filter my request down to for where I want to get involved? I'm kind of new to this project. I've never got involved before, never committed code to it before. Maybe I should filter down to things under good first issue. And by doing that, I will take the issues that are now in the hundreds and reduce them to the dozens. Something within the dozens, I can navigate that and I can find something workable where I can get involved and really make a difference. That is a fantastic way to help people navigate and create pathways through what can be an otherwise confounding experience. All of what we spoke about can seem a bit theoretical, but looking at it through a lens of an example can help concretize what we're talking about with a real world application of it. So we're going to look at one particular example, and we're going to look at it through a project called OpenTelemetry. OpenTelemetry is a fantastic initiative of the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, to bring telemetry data across the board to every project to make it vendor agnostic, meaning that I can incorporate telemetry, meaning usage statistics, server statistics, capturing all the data and all the logging of my application, my service, without needing to be locked into any specific vendor, any specific third-party tooling, and it's open. Like open source, it's OpenTelemetry. And OpenTelemetry has a huge GitHub organization with tons of projects that someone can get involved in and contribute to. Now, when you look at their opening documentation, they have what they call a mission and values statement. And they present there a vision for end users and a vision for contributors. Having the two in conversation with each other helps contributors think, well, when I'm contributing this, does it meet the needs of what this ultimately needs to look like for somebody using it? So in the case of OpenTelemetry, the vision for end users is that telemetry should be easy, telemetry should be universal, it should be vendor neutral, it should be loosely coupled, meaning it shouldn't have to be so directly tied into any implementation. It can be expandable to all sorts of implementations, i.e. scalable and adaptable, and telemetry should be built into every application, every service. The ability and the option to log your data, log your usage statistics, log your application's performance monitoring should be built in to every application and should not have to be something we think of how can we add it. Similarly, they have values for their contributors. So now we know what the end user expectation is. Now I want to get involved. How do I get involved? So as somebody who's walking into this community, I understand by looking at this that we value, i.e. the project values compatibility. Everything I contribute to this project should be standards compliant, vendor neutral, and consistent across all the languages. If I'm working on the Ruby package, it should be consistent with the feature set in the Node.js package, for example. We value stability. We understand that so many libraries and projects and code bases depend on the APIs of OpenTelemetry. So therefore, when we're working on the OpenTelemetry APIs as a new contributor or as an old-time contributor, that we have to make sure that we maintain backwards compatibility for our end users and stability for the API. We want to minimize the breaking changes we're bringing. We also value resiliency, which means the ability to adapt and to continue operating even in the face of resource scarcity or other challenges. So that very much plays with the idea that things need to be adaptable and scalable. We need to be resilient to the ever-changing landscape of software, which, as we all know, changes rapidly and quickly all the time. And lastly, we understand that we want to build projects, we want to contribute code that does not sacrifice the performance of the applications. While I am logging and monitoring the application performance, I should not be impacting negatively that performance. These mission and values, both from the end user perspective and from an open source contributor, help me when I start looking then at the issues that are open, at the projects within the GitHub organization that I can maybe get involved in, help me start navigating where I get involved, how I get involved, and even indeed how I write the code that I'm eventually going to push up as my first commits to any of the projects within OpenTelemetry. Well, what do their README looks like? What do their READMEs look like when you look at OpenTelemetry? And I think here too, we see excellent examples of everything we've been talking about so far. If we take, for example, and look at the Ruby SDK, the Ruby development kit for OpenTelemetry, which parallels itself as we saw in the values for contributors, you find the same thing within the Node.js SDK repository, or the Python repository, or the Golang repository, et cetera, et cetera. We see a good use of badges. Badges are these wonderful little features you can add to READMEs, which quickly delineate and tell somebody something important about your project in a visual and succinct manner. So for example, we see where I can join the Slack community for this project. With one click through that badge, I can join the Slack community of open source contributors of this Ruby SDK. I see that the CI, the CI/CD pipeline, meaning the testing of this project, it's currently passing, meaning that the main branch, the actual application, all of its tests are currently running and passing. And I also see things around the licensing for this project, that the project is licensed under Apache 2.0 license. A license, and we haven't spoken about this too much, but a license is utterly necessary for open source projects if you want to create effective tools for collaboration. A license delineates and makes explicit how I, as a contributor or as a user of this project, can use it. How can I take parts of the code and use it? Do I need to attribute? How do I attribute the code? Without that license, it becomes actually impossible to use the code because any usage of it may violate terms which are not made explicit. So the more you can be explicit on those things, and there are standard licenses one can use. In this case, they use the Apache license. There's also the MIT license. There's many licenses one can find on the internet and use it and incorporate in their project. In addition to that, they also use labels effectively. We discussed how labels help you create pathways for contributors and help new contributors find the pathway that's most appropriate for them. So they write within the top level contributing category on the README, "We'd love your help. Use tags good first issue and help wanted to get started with a project." Meaning if I'm new, I click on the issues and there may be, a plethora of issues, but I know I can immediately filter down to one or both of these labels, good first issue and help wanted, and understand that within those labels, the things that pop up within those labels are areas that I can get involved. And lastly, and I think they do this wonderfully well, which is they name people for further help. Meaning even after a good README and having a code of conduct and having a contributing guide and having good, badges that help me navigate to certain parts of the code or parts of the community like their open community Slack and other things, I may still need further help. I may be still lost. And if I am still lost, I need a lifeline. So knowing where to go, then I can reach out to these people. Now, they may not respond to me right away. Remember, they were all volunteers here, but knowing that I can send a message that within some period of time, I may hopefully hear a response, that helps me put a face to what is otherwise an anonymized project where I am just encountering it through the medium of my monitor, but suddenly now there's people like an Eric and people like a Francis and people like a Daniel who I can reach out to and ask a question, get further clarification, understand how I can best get involved. Similarly, they do a splendid job when it comes to the contributing guide. The contributing guide doesn't assume any level of knowledge. It tells you from the very beginning of how to get involved in the project, what to do. So for example, I'm not going to assume that the user of the potential contributor to my open source project knows how to do quote unquote the basics of Git, like how to clone the project onto their machine. That is considered by many a basic of Git operations. So I may be tempted to ignore it and not put it in my contributing guide because I'm going to assume that person knows how to do that. But if I'm really making a contributing guide where I welcome people from across the spectrum of skill level and experience, I'm not even going to assume that level of knowledge. I'm going to make it explicit. People who know how can skip forward. People who don't know how then are empowered with that knowledge to not only contribute to this project, but to get involved in other projects likewise. And furthermore, you tell people what you expect of them. So for example, I don't expect people to contribute code and push it up as a pull request from your own main branch of your fork of my project. I would expect you to create a feature branch and push it up from your feature branch. Now, if I didn't tell you that, you wouldn't know that. You might guess it, maybe you assume it, maybe you might have seen it in other projects, but that level of assumption can lead us into problems. The less we assume of others and the more explicit we make of our expectations, the better off our projects will be. And lastly, our contributing guide makes clear what it looks like when I'm reviewing your pull request. What am I looking for? How long will the process take? And what kind of expectations might I have as a contributor to what I might be asked to do further when I commit a pull request? All of those things become fundamentally important when I am expecting my community and I'm building a community that I want to be open and welcoming to people from across the spectrum of languages, cultures, experience levels, a place where effective collaboration can occur. So let's say you want to start an open source project. You have created something on GitHub and you're excited to make it welcoming for other people out in the wide world. What are some of the first things you should do? What are the areas that you should really focus on that get the ball rolling and create a project that is opening and welcoming to as many people as possible? Well, make sure you have a concise README with badges. Make sure your contributing guide is transparent and makes the bare necessities that you expect, make them explicit. Create an accountable code of conduct of what is the behavior that is the baseline of a community. What does your community tolerate and what does not tolerate? And if there are violations of that code of conduct, who can someone go to and how can they go to them to remediate and address it? Organize your issues and your pull requests and your conversations with labels so newcomers can come through and navigate effectively. And create a plan for growth for your project that's both flexible and adaptable to the very fast changing and ever evolving landscape of software development. Thank you so much for joining me. It was such a pleasure. I really enjoyed this conversation with you. And if you have any questions, you can find me on Twitter at Rabbi Greenberg or anywhere else online. I look forward to talking to you about open source and getting involved in open source projects with you, wherever you may be and in any project you find interesting. I wish you a great rest of your time at this conference.